collapse does not kill through hunger. It kills through the gap between what people think will last and what actually survives: physics, biology, and time. Every modern food storage promise is built on controlled environments, stable temperature, sealed packaging integrity, predictable humidity, zero shock, and uninterrupted logistics. Remove even one of those conditions, and shelf life curves collapse into failure cascades. The lie was never malicious. It was structural. Manufacturers test foods in laboratories, not in burning cities, flooded apartments, abandoned highways, or homes where power flickers on and off for weeks. And preppers copy those numbers as if the world will honor them when it breaks. Real collapse accelerates degradation. Heat spikes double chemical reaction rates. Humidity forces oxygen into places it should never enter. Microbes bloom because no one has refrigeration, no one has airflow control, and no one has the time or emotional stability to rotate stock with military precision. Food spoils faster under fear, distraction, and displacement than any textbook predicts. The kill mechanism is not starvation itself, but the psychological delay. Humans assume their supplies are intact until they open them. By then, the failure has already occurred. History shows the pattern. Sarajevo's siege, canned goods rupturing after months of temperature cycling. Venezuela's blackout, oils turning rancid in apartments once air conditioning died. Leningrad, insect infestations converting grain stores into dust. Every event follows the same rule. Stored food fails in waves, not gradually. One supply dies, others follow, and people who thought they had months discover they have days. Your reality is simple. In a collapse, storage is not a passive asset. It is a degrading system fighting entropy every hour. Understanding which supplies fail first is not knowledge, it is survival. These 7 do not just expire. They betray you earliest, fastest, and most brutally when conditions turn hostile. The belief in stable shelf life is a civilian illusion. It assumes the environment will cooperate, that packaging will remain intact, that time will behave predictably. But collapse deletes the variables that make shelf life charts real. In controlled storage, temperature swings are limited to a few degrees. In collapse, a single day can swing 40. Controlled storage assumes humidity locked at safe levels. In collapse, moisture infiltrates everything: walls, bags, seams, labels, because no one has power to dry the air. Controlled storage assumes zero physical shock. In collapse, every evacuation, every relocation, every panicked grab and run inflicts microdamage that no chart accounts for. Shelf life numbers are not lies. They are irrelevant. They describe how food behaves when the world still works. The moment systems fail, entropy becomes the primary threat. Heat accelerates oxidation. Moisture fuels mold. Pressure changes break seals. Rodents, insects, and microbes exploit any point of weakness because the predators that normally control them vanish. Human behavior deteriorates too. People stop checking dates. They stop rotating supplies. They stack cans on unstable surfaces. They forget which container took damage during transport. Collapse introduces chaos into every step, and chaos compounds. History exposes the flaw in blind trust. In Syria's urban war zones, sealed flour bags became insect hives within weeks because humidity quietly breached packaging. In Caracas, oils and fats spoiled at triple speed once refrigerators died and apartments turned into ovens. In Sarajevo, many families learned that canned foods exposed to repeated freeze-thaw cycles become biochemical traps, swelling and bursting from internal microbial growth. In Myanmar's flood zones, salt and sugar, supposedly immortal, absorbed contaminants through compromised containers, and became useless. The psychological failure is predictable. People overestimate the durability of stored food because they assume time is neutral. Time is not neutral under collapse. It is hostile. It accelerates every biochemical failure mode and punishes every storage mistake. The core operating truth emerges. Shelf life is not a guarantee, but a fragile promise dependent on stability. And stability is the first commodity to vanish. When the grid dies, logistics disappear, and the environment turns predatory. The food that looked secure on a shelf becomes a decaying asset, racing towards zero. Understanding this illusion is the threshold. Only then can you recognize why certain supplies fail first, and why the clock runs faster than anyone expects once collapse begins. Oils and fats fail before almost any other stored calorie because their destruction is governed by chemistry, not time. Oxidation begins the moment the oil is produced. Light, heat, and oxygen accelerate the breakdown, and collapse accelerates all three simultaneously. In stable conditions, oils degrade slowly. In real-world failure zones, blackouts, evacuations, heat waves, transport shocks, oils do not go bad, they turn hostile. Rancidity is not just foul taste, it is the formation of peroxides, aldehydes, and free radicals that attack the body when it is already weakened from stress and limited nutrition. The kill mechanism is silent. Oils look normal until their molecular structure has already collapsed. By the time you smell bitterness, the damage is mathematical and irreversible. A bottle of vegetable oil exposed to a single afternoon of 40°C heat can undergo months of chemical aging in hours. A container shaken during transport experiences accelerated oxidation from increased oxygen exposure. A pantry that warms during the day and cools at night creates repeated pressure shifts that suck air into containers designed for stability, not turbulence. Collapse guarantees turbulence. Field observations from real disasters prove the pattern. In the Venezuelan blackouts, entire apartment buildings reported stored oils turning bitter and unusable within weeks because the loss of refrigeration turned homes into heat traps. During the Syrian conflict, humanitarian workers noted that donated oil supplies spoiled in transit because trucks lacked climate control, forcing families to rely on inferior, unstable fats scavenged from markets. In the Balkans, survivors from the Sarajevo siege reported that cooking fats were often the first food category to become dangerous, not because of time, but because containers had been repeatedly exposed to heat, cold, and shock as people moved between shelters. Rancid fats are not neutral calories. Under malnutrition, the human body loses buffering capacity. Damaged lipids trigger inflammation, oxidative stress, and digestive instability. In a crisis, this means slower healing, weaker immunity, and reduced ability to function in cold environments where fats should have been a survival resource. The biological punishment compounds. When clean fats fail, the body shifts to consuming its own tissues faster, accelerating muscle loss and cognitive decline. Your storage discipline must reflect operational reality, not fantasy. Clear plastic bottles fail first because light penetration accelerates oxidation. Large containers fail because every opening increases oxygen load. Mixed oils, especially cheap blends, fail because stabilizers break down under heat. Nut oils fail fastest due to high polyunsaturated content. Butter powders and ghee deteriorate under moisture infiltration. Every weakness grows in collapse conditions. Understanding this means adjusting the protocol. Oils must be stored in small, opaque, oxygen-limited containers to reduce total exposure. Duplication is stronger than bulk. Dark, stable microcaches survive better than a single large pantry. Rotation must be aggressive, not scheduled. Every relocation, every heat spike, every power outage resets the clock. If you move your stash, assume the oils lost half their remaining life. If your home overheats for a day, assume an invisible chemical shift occurred. Test the smell, color, and viscosity, but never trust appearance. Oxidation can be advanced long before the senses register it. History makes the truth clear. Starving populations consistently abandon spoiled oils long before running out of grains or sugars because the body rejects rancid fats instinctively. Those who ignored the warning signs suffered digestive collapse and immune degradation that amplified every other threat around them. The operational rule is absolute. Oils and fats are not long-term stores. They are short-term assets pretending to be permanent. Treat them as the first domino in the food chain that will fall. If oils fail, your caloric buffer shrinks, your cooking ability degrades, and your biological resilience collapses. This is why oils are always among the first supplies to die in a real crisis, because physics destroys them faster than hunger can consume them. Flour and grains do not fail slowly. They fail explosively, biologically, and without warning. Under collapse conditions, they transform from calorie reserves into living ecosystems, infested, contaminated, and structurally useless. Civilian storage advice treats grains as stable because laboratory environments assume sealed packaging, controlled humidity, and zero temperature volatility. But collapse destroys these assumptions instantly. Once humidity rises, once air conditioning dies, once containers are moved, shaken, dropped, or micro-torn, grains begin their biological descent. The threat is not time. It is moisture. Even a small humidity increase wakes dormant insect eggs embedded in virtually every commercial grain product. These eggs are harmless in stable, dry conditions. In collapse, they hatch. The transformation is predictable and brutal. Larvae emerge, feed on the starch matrix, excrete microbial-rich waste, and raise internal moisture further. This moisture breeds mold, which releases mycotoxins capable of shutting down liver function and crippling immune defenses already weakened by stress and malnutrition. A bag of flour that once looked clean becomes a self-amplifying colony. The pattern is visible in every real-world breakdown. In the Syrian conflict, humanitarian warehouses discovered that entire pallets of flour had converted into insect webs and fragmented dust within weeks because humidity control was impossible. During the Venezuelan economic collapse, families reported that rice and cornmeal, normally reliable staples, became infested shortly after the loss of refrigeration and airflow. Grain sacks stored in apartments absorbed moisture from concrete floors, turning kernels soft, swollen, and mold-prone. In Leningrad, surviving diaries describe how stalks of barley and wheat became unrecognizable masses of insects and rot by the second winter, forcing civilians to rely on bark, bindings, and improvised substitutes because the grain stores betrayed them early. The kill mechanism is multi-layered. Insects reduce usable calories by consuming the most digestible parts of the grain. Mold introduces toxins the body cannot process under starvation. Micro-damage from transport, drops, compression, dragging, creates invisible tears that admit moisture. Once moisture enters, fermentation begins. Grains do not spoil one bag at a time. They fail in clusters, driven by shared environmental triggers. One compromised sack accelerates the failure of all others stored nearby, spreading humidity and pests outward. Collapse behavior compounds the biological threat. People stack grain bags in corners, against walls, or on floors, areas with the highest moisture absorption. They relocate supplies without resecuring seals. They open containers during periods of high humidity because they lack climate control. They ration without rotation. They believe grains are immortal, so they fail to inspect them until the failure is irreversible. Human error and environmental hostility multiply each other. Flour is even worse. Its surface area to mass ratio allows it to absorb moisture faster than whole grains. It clumps, sours, and becomes a breeding ground for mites and fungi long before any visible discoloration. Under collapse, flour behaves like a sponge placed in an open-air laboratory, pulling in humidity, microbial spores, and airborne contamination from every direction. When baked, contaminated flour releases toxins that a stressed body cannot neutralize. Once infestation begins, the decline is terminal. You cannot dry out the grains because collapse eliminates controlled heat. You cannot sift out contaminants because the moisture has structurally altered the starch. You cannot wash the grains because washing increases microbial load and accelerates spoilage. Most people try anyway. Desperation overrides logic, and they poison themselves slowly through cumulative exposure. The operational truth is uncompromising. Grains are not long-term assets unless stored in hardened, moisture-isolated, oxygen-reduced environments. Any breach, physical or chemical, terminates their viability. The world treats grains as survival staples. History proves they are among the first stored foods to betray their owners in real collapse. Canned goods are marketed as immortal, but their stability exists only while the world behaves. A can is a sealed ecosystem held together by pressure, chemistry, and structural integrity. Collapse disrupts all three. Heat, cold, shock, and time attack the metal shell until failure becomes inevitable. Civilians trust cans because they trust the idea of permanence. But in every real collapse zone, cans are among the earliest supplies to shift from asset to hazard. Heat is the primary accelerator. Every rise in temperature increases internal pressure, stretches seams, and weakens the compound sealant. One heat wave can simulate months of aging inside the container. When the grid dies and blackout cycles roll through a city, apartments turn into ovens. Cans swell, bow, and warp internally, even when they look unchanged from the outside. Repeated thermal cycling, daily heating, and nighttime cooling creates microfractures in the seams. These fractures are invisible to the naked eye, but they allow oxygen and microbes to infiltrate slowly. By the time the can shows outward distortion, the internal contamination is complete. Cold is just as destructive. Freeze-thaw cycles expand the contents, strain the metal, and push the seams open at microscopic levels. Sarajevo's siege documented this clearly. Families moved cans between unheated basements and improvised stoves. Each shift in temperature created expansion cycles that weakened the structure. Cans that survived the first winter failed in the second, because repeated cycles destroyed the seal integrity long before civilians realized it. Shock is the silent killer. Every evacuation, every relocation, every grab and run compresses, dents, or shakes the cans. Even minor dents alter pressure distribution and warp the seam geometry, creating a point of weakness where bacteria can penetrate. Once bacteria enter, they bloom inside the anaerobic environment. Botulism forms precisely under these conditions. Low oxygen, compromised seal, organic content. Collapse guarantees these variables because no one moves gently when running from artillery, police raids, or fires. Every historical collapse zone shows the same pattern. dented cans become biochemical risks, not reserves. Pressure changes also sabotage long-term storage. During infrastructure failure, buildings flood, air pressure fluctuates, and elevation changes occur during evacuations. Each fluctuation stresses the can. A sealed environment is designed for predictability. Collapse is defined by unpredictability. Every deviation compounds internal strain. The psychological failure amplifies the physical one. People assume swollen cans are the only danger, but many of the most dangerous cans look normal. Botulinum toxin develops without expanding the metal if the infiltration is slow and the bacterial colony remains localized. The most lethal cans are often the ones that look intact. Civilians, stressed and distracted, open them anyway. Historical evidence is ruthless. In Sarajevo, many families reported sudden illness after consuming canned meat that appeared visually safe but had undergone 2 years of seasonal temperature cycling. In Venezuela, canned vegetables stored in apartments during prolonged blackouts developed internal corrosion because humidity infiltrated labels and created condensation traps on the metal surface. Corrosion penetrated the seam lacquer and invited microbial bloom. In Ukraine's conflict zones, humanitarian workers found entire batches of canned food compromised simply from being transported across rough terrain, with internal microfractures rendering them biologically unstable. The kill mechanism emerges. Once the seal is compromised, the interior becomes the perfect breeding chamber. Nutrient-rich, oxygen-poor, and unmonitored. Botulism is not a theoretical risk, it is a collapse constant. A single contaminated can incapacitate a weakened body, shutting down neurological function when medical care is already non-existent. Operational protocols must match reality. Cans cannot be stored near heat sources or in rooms that fluctuate in temperature. They cannot be transported repeatedly without inspection. Stacked cans must be separated by material that absorbs shock. Any dent, rust spot, or seam irregularity means immediate rejection. Rotation must be aggressive because the internal chemistry drifts even in the absence of visible defects. And no canned goods survive long-term collapse conditions unless protected inside insulated, vibration-damped, moisture-controlled caches. Cans are not immortal. They are metal shells delaying inevitable failure. Treat them as temporary assets with a short operational window, because in real collapse, they die faster than the myth suggests, and the cost of trusting a compromised can is paralysis, poisoning, or death. Water storage fails faster than food because water is not stable. It is reactive, contaminated easily, and dependent on container integrity. Civilians treat water as a passive resource. Collapse exposes it as the most fragile supply in the entire survival chain. The lie is simple. People believe that because water doesn't expire, stored water is safe. Physics, biology, and material degradation prove the opposite. Plastic containers are the first failure point. Heat softens the polymer structure, causing microscopic deformation that weakens seams. UV exposure accelerates chemical breakdown, releasing plasticizers into the water and making the container brittle. Once brittle, any impact, falling debris, relocation stress, a rapid temperature shift creates hairline fractures. These fractures are invisible but lethal. They allow microbial intrusion, airborne spores, insect contamination, and chemical leaching from the environment. In collapse, where dust is constant, sanitation is non-existent, and movement is chaotic, every container becomes a vulnerability. Microbial film is the silent killer. Even sealed water begins forming biofilm when exposed to heat or light. A single bacterial colony on the container wall can expand exponentially in stagnant storage. Civilians do not test their water. They assume clarity equals safety. In siege environments, responders repeatedly documented that clear water held microbial loads high enough to cause gastrointestinal collapse. The failure mechanism is predictable. A weakened body, consuming contaminated water, enters a dehydration loop. Illness accelerates fluid loss. Drinking increases pathogen load, and the cycle compounds. Filters fail even faster. Collapse eliminates the conditions they require: stable temperature, clean pre-filtering, careful handling, and slow flow rates. Ceramic filters crack under freeze-thaw cycles. Carbon filters become saturated rapidly when forced to process debris-rich water. Hollow fiber filters clog from sediment or bacterial slime. Once clogged, civilians often apply pressure to force water through, tearing microtubes and rendering the filter useless. In conflict zones, humanitarian teams routinely found donated filters non-functional within weeks because the environment destroyed them faster than users realized. Heat and pressure shifts also sabotage storage. Water expands under heat and generates internal pressure against container seams. Blackouts in Venezuela turned stored water into compression bombs. Containers swelled, ruptured, or slowly leaked on floors, mixing with sewage-contaminated floodwater. In Myanmar's flood zones, stored water became poisoned because containers floating in contaminated water absorbed pathogens through compromised seals. In Haiti's post-quake camps, responders reported that bottled water, thought safe, became vectors for cholera due to cross-contamination on damaged caps. Human behavior under collapse accelerates failure. People reuse containers not designed for pressurized liquids. They fill old soda bottles, ignoring that sugar residue forms a breeding ground for bacteria. They store water in direct sunlight. They ration improperly, opening containers repeatedly and introducing airborne microbes. They relocate supplies without securing caps. Every action adds another point where contamination enters. The kill mechanism is immediate. Dehydration disables a human faster than caloric deficit. Water systems collapse mathematically. A person can survive weeks without food, but only days without clean water. This imbalance means any degradation in water supply is exponentially more dangerous than losing food. And once diarrheal illness begins, every contaminated sip accelerates collapse of the body's electrolyte balance. In conflict, famine, and disaster records, dehydration-related death consistently outpaces starvation. Operational reality demands discipline that civilians never practice. Water must be distributed across multiple small hardened containers to minimize total loss risk. Containers must be opaque, UV-resistant, and structurally reinforced. Every major temperature swing resets the contamination clock. Filters require redundancy because every filter will eventually break under field conditions. Stored water must be cycled aggressively because stagnation is a biological invitation. And during collapse, assume all water is contaminated unless purified moments before consumption. Water does not fail gradually. It fails suddenly, catastrophically, and without warning. In every recorded collapse, water is the first resource to betray those who treated it as permanent. The body dies fastest without it. And the environment knows this. Powdered milk and protein supplements are treated as collapse-proof because they are dehydrated, shelf-stable, and compact. But dehydration is not immunity. These products are chemically fragile, moisture-reactive, and structurally unstable once the environment becomes hostile. In collapse, they fail early, fast, and often without visible warning. Civilians imagine powdered foods as inert. Real-world conditions prove they are among the most sensitive supplies in any cache. The enemy is moisture infiltration. Powdered milk, whey, casein blends, soy isolates, and protein mixes are all hygroscopic. They pull water molecules from the air with mechanical inevitability. Once airborne humidity penetrates a seal, even in microscopic amounts, the powder begins clumping. Clumping is not a cosmetic issue. It signals microbial activation, nutrient breakdown, and the start of biochemical decomposition. Collapse guarantees humidity spikes. No electricity means no dehumidifiers. No climate control means hot days, wet nights, sweating walls, and condensation inside containers. Every cycle accelerates spoilage. Packaging is weak by design. Most powdered foods are sealed in thin plastic or foil-lined pouches meant for stable warehouses, not crushed backpacks, flooded floors, or repeated evacuation stress. A flexed corner, a pinhole from rough handling, a weakened seam from temperature shifts. Any breach allows moisture to enter. Powdered milk is especially vulnerable because the fats in it oxidize the moment humidity activates them. What begins as a harmless dry powder can transform into a rancid, chemically altered mass in weeks under collapse conditions. Field evidence is brutal. In Venezuelan blackout zones, powdered milk stocks spoiled rapidly because humidity penetrated packages stored in overheated apartments. Parents mixed spoiled powder with contaminated water, creating a lethal combination that triggered gastrointestinal collapse in children already weakened by malnutrition. In Syrian displacement camps, humanitarian workers reported that protein supplements turned sour, clumped, and refused to mix, even when the outer packaging appeared intact. In Haiti's quake aftermath, powdered nutritional aid arrived viable but failed after transport across humid, debris-filled terrain as the packaging flexed and absorbed ambient moisture. Protein powders also fail chemically. Heat accelerates Maillard reactions inside the powder, degrading amino acids and generating compounds that irritate the gut. Once degraded, the powder loses its nutritional integrity. Instead of building tissue, it taxes the digestive system, forcing the body to expend precious energy processing damaged proteins. In collapse environments where caloric deficit already weakens immunity, consuming degraded protein amplifies inflammation, disrupts digestion, and reduces nutrient absorption from all other foods. Every gram becomes a liability. The most dangerous failure mode is invisible contamination. Powders mix with air when opened. Under collapse, the air carries fungal spores, dust, insect fragments, rodent dander, and airborne pathogens. Every scoop introduces new microbial load. Civilians ration slowly, opening and closing containers repeatedly, each time inserting humidity and contamination. By the time the powder smells off, the internal microbial population has already reached levels that trigger illness. And because powder dissolves into water, it hides contamination extremely well. Clear liquid does not mean clean liquid. It only means the microbes have dispersed evenly. Human behavior worsens the outcome. People stretch supplies past their safe window, believing dryness equals safety. They mix powder with unsafe water. They store partially used bags with air trapped inside. They place containers near stoves, not realizing heat drives moisture into the powder. They move supplies during evacuation, crushing seals. Every mistake compounds. The biological consequences are immediate. Consuming compromised milk powder triggers vomiting, diarrhea, and electrolyte loss, the exact conditions most lethal in resource-scarce environments. Degraded protein suppresses immune function at the moment it is most needed. Infants, the elderly, and the malnourished collapse first. But even healthy adults degrade rapidly when digestive function fails. The operational truth is uncompromising. Powdered foods must be stored in hardened, moisture-proof, oxygen-reduced containers, isolated from temperature swings and divided into small units to minimize exposure. Once opened, they have a countdown measured in days, not months. Anything clumped, sour, or discolored is a threat, not a resource. In collapse, no powdered food is long-term. It is a short-window supplement pretending to be a stable supply. Powders fail quietly, chemically, and biologically. And when they fail, they do not merely reduce calorie availability, they poison the body at the moment it can least afford to fight back. Medicated and fortified foods are sold as nutritional insurance. Vitamin-enriched grains, fortified bars, electrolyte powders, therapeutic rations. Civilians believe these products retain their potency indefinitely because the label suggests engineered stability. Collapse reveals the opposite. These foods are chemically unstable, heat-sensitive, and prone to micronutrient decay far faster than ordinary staples. What looks like a superfood during normal times becomes a dead, nutrient-hollow shell once the environment turns hostile. Vitamins are molecules with weak structures. Heat destroys them first. Vitamin C breaks down rapidly in temperatures above 30 degrees Celsius. B vitamins degrade under humidity and light exposure. Fat-soluble vitamins oxidize the moment oxygen infiltrates packaging. In a blackout, every pantry becomes a heat chamber. Every sealed package becomes a compromised microenvironment. The destruction is quick, invisible, and irreversible. Fortified flour, cereals, bars, and powdered mixes lose their advertised nutritional value long before their expiration dates when subjected to the temperature volatility that defines every real collapse. The science is straightforward. Nutrients do not fail linearly, they collapse exponentially. One heat spike can neutralize months of shelf life. One breach in packaging allows oxygen to reduce potency to a fraction of its label claim. Vitamin degradation accelerates as the product ages, as the packaging flexes, and as humidity infiltrates. Collapse multiplies these factors simultaneously. People think they are storing nutrients. In reality, they are storing calories with empty shells of once functional compounds. History exposes this pattern with precision. During the siege of Leningrad, civilians consumed fortified breads and rations that, on paper, should have sustained micronutrient levels. But after months of cold, humidity, and storage degradation, those foods lost nearly all vitamin content. Immune systems collapsed. Scurvy reappeared. Wounds refused to heal. In Venezuelan blackout conditions, fortified children's cereals were found to contain less than half of their intended vitamin load because heat and humidity destroyed the enrichment compounds. Humanitarian workers in Syrian camps repeatedly documented that fortified aid rations, after transport across hot terrain, arrived with severely degraded nutritional profile, still edible, still caloric, but biologically insufficient for survival. The consequences are lethal because micronutrient failure does not announce itself. The body degrades quietly. First comes fatigue from B vitamin loss, then immune weakness from destroyed antioxidants, then tissue breakdown as fat-soluble vitamins oxidize and vanish. The collapse is internal. A person eating supposedly nutritious food remains in deficit without realizing it. Under stress and caloric restriction, the body burns through micronutrients even faster. Once the supply is gone, infections gain ground, wounds fester, and cognitive clarity declines. Micronutrient collapse kills through vulnerability. Your defenses disappear while you believe you're still protected. Compounded chemical reactions create further risks. As vitamins degrade, they produce byproducts that affect taste, color, and smell only at advanced stages. Long before those warning signs appear, the food has already lost biological value. Some fortified bars develop bitterness from oxidized compounds. Others become harmful by increasing inflammatory load on a malnourished digestive system. Electrolyte powders degrade into uneven mineral concentrations, risking hypernatremia or potassium imbalance when mixed into unstable water sources. Under collapse, every variable works against safety. Contaminated water, heat-damaged powders, weakened bodies. Human error accelerates failure. Civilians store vitamin-rich foods near stoves, in hot cars, on sunlit shelves. They rotate improperly. They assume dry equals stable. They split large packages into smaller ones without oxygen control. They carry fortified supplies in backpacks exposed to sweat, heat, and friction, destroying potency through constant microstress. They overestimate labels and underestimate chemistry. Operational reality demands a different mindset. Fortified and medicated foods must be treated as perishable biochemical tools, not long-term reserves. Their storage requires insulation, darkness, moisture barriers, and minimal movement. Small units outperform bulk. Redundancy outperforms confidence. And potency must be assumed to degrade the moment collapse begins. These foods are last-line supplements, not primary nutrition. Once micronutrient failure begins, no calorie surplus can compensate for biological deterioration. The truth is cold. Collapse does not just strip you of food. It strips your body of the microscopic defenses that keep you alive. Medicated and fortified foods fail early because their strength, the engineered delicate compounds inside them, is the first thing destroyed when the world stops cooperating. Sugar and salt carry the myth of immortality. Every prepper repeats it. They last forever. Under laboratory stability, that statement is nearly true. Under collapse, it becomes a lethal assumption. Sugar and salt are chemically stable, but their stability is dependent on environment. The moment humidity, contamination, container failure, or flood intrusion appears, these forever foods transform into compromised, biologically active, or chemically altered substances that no longer serve their purpose and may even become dangerous. Humidity is the first enemy. Both sugar and salt pull moisture aggressively when exposed to the air. Collapse guarantees humidity spikes, no climate control, no dry storage, no ventilation, no insulation. Once moisture infiltrates storage, sugar clumps, hardens, and begins fermenting, if microbial spores are present. What looks like solid sugar may be chemically altered inside, with microbial colonies growing in moisture pockets. Mold does not grow on pure sugar, but contaminated sugar is no longer pure. In Venezuelan heat waves, entire bags of sugar turned into solid, sour-smelling bricks that civilians had to discard because moisture breached packaging, initiating microbial activity. Salt behaves differently, but fails just as fast under hostile conditions. Moisture does not ferment salt. It dissolves it. Floodwater intrusion, condensation, or even contact with humid air begins dissolving surface layers. Dissolved layers then wick contaminants inward. In real collapses, salt stored in thin packaging becomes a sponge for sewage particles, dust, heavy metals, and industrial residue. Once contaminated, it becomes toxic, not salvageable. Myanmar's flood zones documented bags of salt swollen, damp, and unusable because flood water brought pathogens and chemicals directly into the supply. Container failure is the second destroyer, and it happens silently. Thin plastic bags tear under pressure during evacuations. Boxes collapse when wet. Metal tins rust from condensation and leach corrosion byproducts into the contents. Improvised containers, soda bottles, food jars, scrap metal cans fail because sugar and salt are chemically abrasive. They strip microplastics, residues, and metal ions into the food. Collapse multiplies these risks with every relocation, every drop, every ambient shake. Flooding turns immortal foods into biochemical hazards. When floodwater enters a home, it carries sewage, petrochemicals, parasites, and industrial runoff. Sugar and salt absorb these contaminants through damaged packaging or through any breach created by impact or compression. After the 2010 Pakistan floods, survivors reported that entire regional salt stores became toxic because water infiltrations carried pathogens into exposed bags stacked on floors. Sugar dissolved, re-solidified, and locked bacterial contamination inside crystalline structures that remained invisible to civilians, who later tried to salvage it. Environmental contamination is the next threat. Sugar attracts insects instantly. Ants breach the smallest gaps. Cockroaches deposit microbial-loaded waste. Rodents chew through packaging, leaving behind droppings that introduce fungal spores and deadly bacteria like Leptospira. Salt, though unattractive to insects, attracts moisture. Moisture introduces mold spores, dust particulates, and airborne toxins. Raw, unrefined salts also carry trace minerals that oxidize under humidity, creating chemical off-odors and color shifts. In collapse, these shifts accelerate. Human behavior under stress guarantees contamination. People store salt and sugar near stoves, where steam infiltrates the supply. They open bags with wet hands. They leave containers partially unsealed during rationing. They relocate supplies in the rain. They store them on concrete floors that wick moisture upward. They stack them against exterior walls that drip condensation in temperature swings. Every mistake compounds, accelerating the destruction. Even when not contaminated, degraded sugar and salt lose functional value. Sugar that has absorbed moisture caramelizes unpredictably during cooking, making it useless for preservation. Salt diluted by moisture loses density and alters preservation ratios. In crisis preservation, curing meat, fermenting vegetables, stabilizing protein, precision matters. Using compromised salt destroys entire batches, causing bacterial overgrowth and food poisoning. The operational truth is absolute. Sugar and salt are only forever inside controlled environments. Collapse removes control. Without airtight, moisture-proof, impact-resistant containers elevated above floor level and isolated from heat and flood risk, both substances degrade quickly. And once degraded, they cannot be restored. They must be discarded. An unthinkable loss when every calorie and mineral matters. The myth is comforting. The reality is mathematical. In real collapse, even the immortals fail. Collapse is not a slow decline. It is a mathematical acceleration of failure. Food storage is not a passive reserve waiting to be used. It is an active system under constant attack by heat, moisture, oxygen, microbes, pressure shifts, physical shock, and human error. Every supply you store begins dying the moment stability ends. The curve is not linear. It steepens with each environmental stressor, each relocation, each blackout, each forgotten inspection. Collapse punishes assumptions faster than it punishes hunger. Every category of food that civilians trust collapses in predictable waves. Oils fail chemically, turning rancid under heat and oxygen drift. Grains fail biologically, becoming insect engines and mold factories. Cans fail structurally, their seams breaking under thermal cycles and shock. Water fails at the container level, then biologically, then fatally. Powders fail through moisture infiltration and invisible contamination. Fortified foods fail microscopically, losing the nutrients needed to keep the body functional. Even sugar and salt, supposed immortals, fail under the simple physics of humidity and contamination. The order is consistent across every war zone, blackout, refugee crisis, and long-term disaster. Failure always begins earlier than predicted. The constant across history is that no variable remains stable under collapse. Temperature becomes unpredictable. Humidity becomes invasive. Movement becomes chaotic. Sanitation becomes non-existent. Time becomes hostile. Humans operate under fear, fatigue, and cognitive decline, magnifying every mistake. The environment shifts from neutral to predatory, seeking every crack, seam, or lapse in discipline. Entropy wins because collapse removes the systems built to hold it back. What survives is not the food with the longest printed shelf life. What survives is the food stored inside, hardened, insulated, shock-protected, moisture-isolated, oxygen-reduced microcaches, managed by someone who understands that storage is a living, degrading process, not a static asset. Long-term survival is not defined by how much you store, but by how well you defend every calorie from environmental attack. There is a final operational equation that governs collapse: rate of degradation, rate of consumption, system death. It applies to food, water, energy, health, and the body itself. When your supplies fail faster than you can use them, collapse becomes fatal. When your defenses slow degradation below your consumption rate, survival becomes possible. The truth is merciless. Stored supplies are not a guarantee. They are a race against entropy. Collapse does not care how prepared you felt. It cares only about physics, biology, and time. If you treat storage as static, you lose. If you treat it as a dynamic system under constant threat, you survive.